Okay, so good evening, everybody. Welcome to our next chapter of Jewish history. I'm so glad for people that have stuck around through these 3,500 years. I'm glad that you have made it with us to the 20th century today. So just a little bit of review of everything we've done last time, just to set us up, because really last time was an important theoretical framework to understanding a lot of the discussions we're going to be having today. Last time we really unpacked the origins of Zionism, and one of the ways in which I framed it, and one of the ways in which I think it's really helpful to think about Zionism, is both as a radically, deeply traditional Jewish movement, and also at the same time, a radically, deeply challenging of traditional Judaism, and a movement that really was just as radical, if not more, as all the other radical movements we've discussed, such as Hasidic Judaism and Kabbalah, such as the Reform movement, and other ways of really understanding Judaism that were an answer to, again, just like all times of Jewish history, answers to pressing historical or sociological problems, which, of course, from a bird's eye lens of just our trek through Jewish history here, one of the ways in which a community evolves, and one of the things in which I think Judaism has been especially adept at doing over the past 3,000 years, is confronting challenges in a very unique way head on, in a way that allows Judaism to stay Judaism, but also allow it to innovate enough to meet whatever challenges. So whether we're talking about the innovation of Jeremiah 2,500 years ago, when he taught that Israelites are allowed to be Jewish and practice Judaism outside of the land of Israel, whether we're talking about the rabbinic revolution post-destruction of the temple, medieval philosophy, Kabbalah, Hasidic Judaism, the Haskalah, Reform movement, right? Zionism is another example in a long line of radical Jewish movements that, again, attempted to push forward and also at the same time root us in tradition. And so last time we did a lot of the theoretical work behind Zionism. And so today I thought I would jump right in with a little bit of the history. And again, just like always, feel free to cut me off wherever, and we'll just plunge right into it. So we discussed the theoretical framework last time. So I'm going to assume at least some knowledge of, if I say the political Zionists versus revisionist Zionists, I'll explain a little bit, but I'm going to assume some knowledge of that just for this class. I want to actually start a little bit before Herzl. We didn't talk about this much last time. Last week, I really started with Theodor Herzl answering the Jewish question in the late 1800s as, again, just a very quick review. The question that all Jewish thinkers were asking was, Jews were granted legal emancipation for about 100 years. And what do you know? Anti-Semitism did not automatically disappear. And so there were many, or a plethora of ways in which Jewish thinkers thought to respond. One was, of course, to just say, we will reduce Judaism to a confessional religion so we can be good Frenchmen or Germans. Other ways were for Jews to join the socialist or communistic revolutions. Other ways were for Jews to go all in on liberalism and capitalism, right? None of these ideas worked. And so we get Theodor Herzl talking about this new idea of a return to a homeland. But I did hint last time, and here I will complicate a little bit of the story that I told a week ago, that Herzl, of course, was not the first person to come up with this idea, even after the Haskalah, of returning to the ancient homeland of Israel. And just one other note, I'm going to be using Israel and Palestine relatively interchangeably today, because most of what we're talking about, at least in the beginning, is going to be pre-1948. And so just so we all understand terminology there. So in 1881, which if we look to Russia and Eastern Europe, this was a time of particularly tough situation for the Jews. We saw a proliferation of pogroms happening all throughout Eastern Europe, all throughout Russia. This is also, I think I mentioned this several classes ago, but for those who are familiar with the conspiratorial book, The Protocols of Elders of Zion, which teaches of this grand Jewish plot to take over the world and the banks and to cause wars and all of these things, right? This was published anonymously in Russia exactly at this time. And so we start to see groups of Eastern European Jews moving to ancient Israel, and some of them are motivated by some vague ideas, maybe by Moshe Hess or Leo Pinsker, right? Just two names to throw out there, of perhaps we should start returning to a homeland. But mostly this was not motivated by any grand political ideology. This was just another example throughout our history of Jews having to flee, trying to look around the world, figuring out, where are we going to be safe? what do you know? The Ottoman Empire, still in the 1800s, was one of the best places in the world to be Jewish, even though it had its dark moments. And so you started seeing tens of thousands of Jews in what's known as Hovevei Zion, which in Hebrew translates to the lovers of Zion, all of a sudden moving to Israel. Again, this is before anyone would call it political Zionism, but tens of thousands of Jews are already settling there, and they are starting what's called the Yeshuv. And so they are, just to backtrack for a minute, if people have heard of the city Rishon LeZion in Israel, right? It's a city close to Tel Aviv, right? That just means first to Zion. And that was, again, a city that was set in the 1880s by this group of what's called the first Aliyah, or the first going up to Israel. Just one other thing to point out is at the same time, there was a messianic movement going throughout a lot of Mizrahi Jewish communities, mostly the Yemenite Jewish community, and groups of Yemenite Jews were also now moving to Israel, not to flee anti-Semitism, not for secular reasons, but because they started thinking the time is ripe, and this is now our moment, right? The Messiah is either coming or on his way, right? Things are going to be happily ever after. And actually, the only reason why I bring this up, that the first Aliyah was both secular Eastern Europeans and Messianic or more religious Mizrahi Jews, isn't because this is a particularly important historical point, but I think that this actually does a good job at representing a lot of the later struggles that the Zionist movement would have in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and even now in Israel, where most Zionists, again, if we remember back to last week, were from Europe. Most of them were predominantly secular. If we remember from last week, the vast majority of the Orthodox Jewish community was against Zionism. The vast majority of the Reform Jewish community was against Zionism. And so if you imagine anyone who would call themselves a religiously affiliated Jew, you would probably not be a Zionist in the year 1920. And so that left a group of very secular Ashkenazi Jews. And then all of a sudden, right, we know things in the Arab world started getting much worse for Jews in the 1920s, 30s, and then just, again, dropping off a cliff from there in terms of quality of life. And as Jews from the Mizrahi world started moving in, right, this created one of the flashpoints that's still today in modern Israel, which is namely, how religious of a country should it be, right? And a lot of things I'll do today, just so you understand the methodology, I'm going to try to go through history, but instead of painting it just as, here's a date, here's what happened, let's move on, I'm going to try to tease out where the flashpoints are in modern Israel by understanding historical events. And so one of the things that, again, we've seen all throughout Israel's history that, again, is to this day, is when we say that Israel is a Jewish state, what does that mean? If you are a secular Ashkenazi Zionist in the year 1900, you would probably say, as Herzl did, that what it means to have a Jewish state means a state that protects ethnic Jews. Right. The problem is that ethnic Jews are under attack because of their ethnicity. Right. This, of course, gets even more dire once Hitler rises to power and posits a completely ethnic or racial view of Judaism. Therefore, you need a state that is secular in the religious sense, but is Jewish in the ethnic sense to some extent. Right. It gives Jews by ethnicity a better chance at citizenship and all of these other things that we can unpack later, right? If you are now coming as a, let's say, Mizrahi Jew, or we introduced Rav Kook last week from more of the religious Zionist perspective, you are going to be, again, you are going to have a slightly different view. You are going to think that, no, when we say a Jewish state, this means that Israel must actually have the underpinnings of a theocracy to some extent. And obviously, it's not a binary between secular and theocracy, but Israel has constantly been having this debate over the past really 120 years, even before the state was founded. So again, in the late 1800s, all of these Jews are now moving to Israel, which really gets the early Zionist movement rolling. Just so we get some hard numbers here, in the year 1900, so 123 years ago, in the entirety of the land, and when I say entirety of the land, that is everything between the river and the sea, so what some would call Israel and Yehuda v'Shamron, Israel and the West Bank, Israel and Palestine, whatever terminology you want to use, in that entire area, there were roughly 500,000 people. 85% of those people were Arab, and Arabs, of course, can come in, right? There are Muslim Arabs and there are Christian Arabs, and about 10% of people living in that entire land, the land of Israel in the year 1900, 10% were Jewish, and then about 5% were various internationals, right? This ended up becoming an extremely important geopolitical area already from the outset. And so in 1901, again, just to sort of paint the picture, right, this is when the JNF is established. And the JNF, of course, is still alive and well today, right, the Jewish National Fund. And the explicit goal, right, today, a lot of people think of it as if you have a bar mitzvah, you donate a tree via the JNF. But back in the early 1900s, this was the primary vehicle for the purchase of land, first through the Ottoman Empire, and then, of course, after World War I, through either local Arabs or through the British government. And here we get to another controversy, one in which we'll actually come back to today, which is people who are trying to invalidate the country of Israel. You can take that to mean however you want it, will say that Israel or the Jews or the Zionists stole the land. In reality, right, it's a lot more complicated than that, right? I don't want to oversimplify this to saying, no, they bought everything, and we'll go through some of the complications here. I definitely don't want to shy away from controversy, but the vast majority of land was actually bought. Now, this doesn't mean that all is happily ever after, because one of the situations, and this gets a little bit complicated, but if we imagine the Ottoman Empire has been in control of this area for hundreds of years, without going too much into the Ottoman Empire history, but I think this is an important tidbit, the Ottoman Empire ends up in a series of wars throughout the 1800s, and the Ottoman Empire is becoming increasingly bankrupt, and its power is continually weakening throughout the 1800s. It's why the Ottoman Empire, on a quick tangent, ends up joining World War I, because it actually ends up owing a lot of countries a lot of land, right? That's a whole other class. But the Ottoman Empire is in need of money. And so the Ottoman Empire is looking around, right? Most of the land in the Ottoman Empire was owned by the empire, but they had been, again, lending it out on these, really forever loans to local farmers all around the Ottoman Empire. Now, if you're a bankrupt empire and all of a sudden a bunch of people in nice suits show up to your door and say, this tiny piece of land that nobody really cares about, aside from obviously the farmer and his family that's been living there for hundreds of years, we will pay you some exorbitant amount of money for this land. Can we have it? So the Ottoman Empire, of course, says, well, yes, this is a great deal. They buy it, right? This is all happening in Turkey or other places, right? This is what the original Zionist congresses were busy doing and raising money for throughout the early 1900s. Now, all of a sudden, you knock on someone's door in the middle of modern day Israel, and you say, hi, my name is Daniel. This is now my land, right? Sorry, you're going to have to leave. And this is actually enforced by the Ottoman Empire. So if the person says, what the heck are you talking about? You call the Ottoman authorities and they kick that person out. Now, already we get to a flashpoint of complexity here, because on the one hand, and we can probably debate this forever, so I don't want to spend too long on this point, but on the one hand, if you are, let's say, taking the stereotypical pro-Israel side, you will say, well, everything was completely kosher, right? The way in which the world works is people buy and sell land all the time. And that's just how the world works. If anything, if you look at how other countries were founded, it was almost always by conquering and taking. Zionism was mostly by buying, right? If you're taking the other side, right? Again, the stereotypical anti-Israel side, obviously positions exist in the middle. You're going to say, well, wait a minute, throughout the entirety of the 18 and early 1900s, we know that European colonialist powers were busy showing up all across the Middle East and all across Africa, and basically showing up and saying, this is our land now. All of a sudden now, a bunch of Ashkenazi Jews from Britain, France, Germany, all these countries are showing up. They look like the colonialist power people. They sound like the colonialist power people. How can we know that they are a part of this multi-thousand-year tradition, right? So they see, again, the stereotypically Eastern European or Western European people showing up, and for all intents and purposes, removing them from their house that they've lived on for generations. And these people are saying they have the deed, but they've never seen a deed in their life, because the assumption was this land has been in their family for generations. So already you can see the flashpoint and underpinnings of what eventually becomes known as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this will become important later. And again, happy to take comments and questions. Again, feel free to interrupt me. But now in 1909, with some land starting to be purchased, now we see the beginning of the kibbutz movement. And so again, just 2 minutes on kibbutzim and how they connect to all of this, right? Last week we discussed that that basically all political Zionists were socialist or communist in orientation. And so the kibbutz system was basically one of the few times in which scholars suggest that socialism might have actually worked in the history of the world, right? Kibbutzim were these socialist small communities where, again, in the early days of Zionism, kibbutzim were radically socialist, even to the point where children weren't raised in their own home, right? If I had a child, the second that child was self-sufficient, I would send that child to live in the child home, and everybody in the kibbutz would be equally responsible for everything else. Today in Israel, obviously some kibbutzim still exist, but capitalism has seeped into a large extent to a lot of kibbutzim, or the vast majority of them. But in terms of early Zionism, this is one of the ways in which actually a lot of historians think that the original yishuv, that the original foundation of Jews moving to this land were able to actually survive by having this basically communal idea that everybody is fully invested in the mission. And then again, as we discussed, this starts to brew tensions between Jews and Arabs, and we already got into how this cultivates the dual narrative. Now, before I pause for questions and comments, I want to read one quote from Israeli historian Benny Morris, who, for those who have not heard of Benny Morris, he is one of those historians that really upsets people on every which direction. He's what's known as, I see a couple of smirks there, which is great. He's what's known as sort of the new historian in Israel. And just to sort of explain what that means, for about, and you can, again, everybody can judge the validity of his comments and his framing in a few minutes, but for, let's say, the first 50 years of Israel's existence, so now we're talking 1948 to, let's say, the 90s, so someone could do the math there, 40-something years, the dominant narrative, and again, Israel is a much less liberal country than America. And when I mean liberal, I mean in terms of freedoms, and there's obvious reasons for that in Israel, right? There's a lot more security threats, right? There's always to some extent, zero-sum game between how much government overreach you want to have, how safe you are, and how much freedom do you have, right? If the government can read everything that I send in an email, I have less freedom, but everybody else will be more safe. So Israel historically has taken more of a conservative position in terms of security, which obviously limits freedoms. But one of the things that Israel also does under this umbrella is the government keeps a lot more information confidential. And so for the first 50 years of Israel's existence, we didn't know much about what was happening in terms of the wars that happened pre-1948 and even the 1948 war. And so there was this gray area that existed that, again, still to this day, if you try to ask somebody to give you a straight answer about what happened in the 1948 war, you're going to get 17 opinions and, have 10 people leave ragingly upset at somebody else. And so I'm not going to try to unpack all of that, but all that's to say is it's really complicated to try to piece back the pictures of what happened in a war 75 years ago when both sides have a vested interest in telling a singular narrative. Benny Morris was one of the first people who came and really tried to unpack all of this and actually spend years looking at all of the documents and putting together a picture. And he writes a series of books that, again, were very disliked by the mainstream Israeli population, but also very much disliked by the mainstream Palestinian population, who had their own narrative of the evil Zionists that came in and just forcibly removed everybody. And I see in the comments, two books are mentioned, which are both great. I always love mentioning books. So Amos Oz, of course, the famous, I don't know if he won a Nobel Prize, but he was up for the Nobel Prize. Israeli author Amos Oz, he wrote a book called A Tale of Light and Darkness that's about this period. It's absolutely excellent. And then Ruth said, Ari Shavit wrote a book called My Promised Land, which again, I think does a good job at a explanation of the Israeli left. So if anybody's looking for further reading, look in the comment section. So Benny Morris writes a book called Righteous Victims. And here is how he frames what is going on between 1882 and 1914, which is really the first stage of Zionism, right? Everything pre-World War I. And he says as follows, and then we can unpack this, right? He says the major cause of tension and violence throughout the period was not accidents, misunderstandings, or the attitudes and behaviors of each side, but objective historical conditions and the conflicting interests and the goals of the two populations. The Arabs sought instinctively to retain the Arab and Muslim character of the region and to maintain their position as its rightful inhabitants. The Zionists sought to radically change their status quo, buy as much land as possible, settle on it, and eventually turn an Arab-populated country into a Jewish homeland. For decades, the Zionists tried to camouflage their real aspirations for fear of angering the authorities and the Arabs. They were, however, certain of their aims and of the means needed to achieve them. Internal correspondence among the Olim, right, the people who are part of these aliyot, from the very beginning of the Zionist enterprise leaves very room for doubt. So again, just to paint the complexity of this, it's always a fool's errand trying to, and this is something I'm constantly telling students, right? As you can imagine, these topics come up on campus quite a bit, right? It's always to some extent a fool's errand to try to apply 2023 logic and ideology to the early 1900s when the world was just so radically different, it's hard to understand how people thought. That doesn't mean everything that happened in history gets a green light and a pass, but it does mean, again, even if we would question sort of the ethics of coming in and buying land, seeing what else was happening in terms of the colonization of the Middle East and of Africa by predominantly European powers, to some extent, this is the Zionist movement trying to actually act in a, to some extent, morally righteous or a better way than their wider European counterparts, because the wider framework of the day in terms of getting land was showing up and taking it, right? Now, all of a sudden, they're trying to buy it. Things end up getting a little bit more complex as time goes on. But what Benny Morris is describing here is as you have increased settlement, right, of the early aliyot and of the early Zionist movement, as it's slowly catching steam in the 1900s, you start to see increasing violence breaking out in the streets, increasing skirmishes, and this is sort of setting the groundwork for, again, what we now all know has been an 100 plus year conflict. This is before now, just to two more data points, and then I'll take any comments and questions. This is before there were any major attacks on any Zionist cities or villages. There were, of course, random skirmishes, but there was nothing like we're going to see in 1929 as we go on a little bit. And this is also before there was any sort of organized militia from the Zionist movement. Again, this is before the Haganah was founded. That's not going to be founded for another 10 or so years. Let's take a couple minutes for any thoughts and questions. And yeah, I see Robin wrote in the chat, it's not as if the Palestinians couldn't have bought land too. Yeah, you're entirely right from a legal perspective. I mean, I think if I was going to play devil's advocate, what one would say is they just had no money, and there was sort of this wider joint effort. Robin, go for it.
Yeah, it just seems like in so many, you know, when we compare these narratives, one of the things that really feels so disingenuous is the way that you know, one side is illustrated or conveyed as having absolutely no agency. Like they had who could have thought, you know, who could have gone to try to find out who owned the land? It was impossible. Who would do such a thing? Well, people did that kind of thing. And, you know, it's not like, as you said, the Jews of the time didn't come in and invade. They used the legal, you know, whatever legal regulations and vestiges were available to them.
Yeah, 100%. Henry, go for it.
Well, sure, the people living in the area, the Arabs living in the area, were very poor, but so were the Jews. They were really in horrible shape, and they were fortunate because they were able to raise money outside of the region.
Yeah, 100%. The Zionists that were living in the land of Israel at this time were completely destitute. Point granted. Yeah, and exactly what you said, right? They had sort of this wider, right? They had all these international corporations like the JNF that were sort of helping fund, right? A lot of this was specifically actually American dollars, right? Not that anyone here.
But the first thing also that the Zionists did is they started to create institutions that were needed to be a nation. That wasn't a priority at all with the let's call them the indigenous people, but we were the indigenous people as well. So okay.
Yeah, no, 100%. And points about indigeneity are complicated. I mean, this word has been popular in conversations about Israel as of late. So yes, Jews are of course indigenous to Israel. I mean, we've just spent 16 weeks talking about Jewish history. It's very hard to make the argument not so. There was actually some writers. Ironically, they were Jewish writers, and you'll understand why in a second, writing in the early 1900s that were trying to come up with, now we know to be extremely faulty, but they were trying to suggest theories that suggested that Ashkenazi Jews were not indigenous to Israel, but that they were a series of converts. Again, some of them suggest the Khazar nation in the 8th century. There are other theories, but ideas that Ashkenazi Jews are actually indigenous Europeans that mass converted. The reason why a lot of Jews were trying to make this argument, of course, was because racial anti-Semitism was getting so bad in Europe that if you were only able to tell these anti-Semites or the Nazis, hey, wait a minute, we are Europeans too, we just are practicing a different religion, but we're not racially different, that of course would have saved the lives of millions of Jews. And so you had Jewish intellectuals that were trying to push this argument, right? The argument's not correct because it was based on faulty genetic data, and now they've done genetic testing and just one test just to throw it out there, right? So my last name is Levine, right? I am a Levite, right, from the tribe of Levi, and they've done these genetic testings where they've tried to isolate, let's say, genes that only Kohanim or Leviim have. And it doesn't matter if you're Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Sephardi, it doesn't, if your family's lived in Asia for the last 2,000 years, right? They all go back to the Middle East, right? And they've done a series of other studies, right, without getting too much into the genetics. But yes, the jury's closed on that one, right? And the same vein, right? Are Palestinians indigenous? Some might say, well, no, they're not, because, right, we didn't have time to go into the history of that land. And we know that, right, after the Crusades came, then in the 12th century, Muslim invaders came, and then they basically ruled over it for 800 years. On the other hand, right, a new identity, right, identities don't take 800 years to form. And if your people have been living on a land for hundreds of years, right, and they've cultivated a national identity that, of course, grew in the late 1800s and early 1900s as Palestinian identity did, but that's when national identity in general was becoming a thing, and it took a little bit later to come to the Arab world. And so personally, I would say that both Jews and Palestinians are indigenous, but yes, that was also obviously simmering in the background here. And yeah, one of the other things, or Sydney, go for it, and then I'll say one more thing.
I just wanted to say that whether you think this is a good way to go and buy the land or a bad way to go, it is part of a worldwide thing that happened where you had multitudes of poor people who lived on land and they didn't own the land. They worked the land. And whenever a better, money opportunity showed up, they were en masse sent, off the land. And that happened in Scotland and, Ireland and Syria and Egypt,
And Yorba Linda.
Yorba Linda with the farmers and it's a sad thing when people are just tenant farmers. You watched the sad thing about, when you started to have the wars in Kansas and all of a sudden people are farming and you can't, there's just war. And the poor person who doesn't have ownership of the land, it's just sad, but it's a thing that's happened throughout the world, and this was part of it, just another part.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, I totally agree with all of that. And then to add on to something that I think Henry hinted to, which adds another layer of complexity. Again, this is not going to be the place to get, simple talking points about Israel Zionism or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is places to leave with a reading list of 20 books and be even more confused. It is also true that once the early Zionists came in and they brought all these investments, they also built up institutions that made the region a better place to live. And so you had a lot of immigration, not just from Jews. I'll have a map in a couple slides, but also Arabs started moving to the area from other Arab countries. And the Arab population of what we now know as Israel-Palestine grew at a rate that's higher than a lot of the neighboring countries. And so, right, this adds just layers and layers of complexity, because all of a sudden, if you are building a rail station, which still today in Jerusalem, you can go to Tachana Rishona, right? It's no longer a working rail station. Now it has expensive places to eat dinner, right? But again, these are some of the institutions, right? Early hospitals, right? They were bringing in the state-of-the-art European technological and medical and agricultural advancements into a land that was about 150 years behind Europe technologically. And so obviously this becomes a better place to live. And at the same time, right, all of Sydney's points taken for right granted, where it still doesn't make it better when the guy shows up to your house with the deed saying, no, sorry, this is my house now. You're gonna have to move. So all of these points taken, right? And so just so we can see a little map here of where some of the early Yeshuvim, right, from 1881 to 1914 were, again, all of the dark black, right, that is the dominant areas in which Jews lived, right? Probably none of these cities will be surprising to you. And in the squares, there are the major Arab towns. And so you can kind of see already, this is sort of a situation where you have sprinklings of one population living very close to, if not right on top of the other. And just for people who need a length map, right, this is 15 miles. And so, right, you can see the entire stretch of the country is 65 miles in some place, 90 miles in another place. And so we're not talking about the size of California here. I think when I looked it up, 19 Israels fits into the state of California. So just to get a sense of this area, right, we're not talking about a massive area. Really, we're talking about everything south of LA to Mexico in terms of geographical area. And so, right, this brings us into, of course, the next important stage of history. Again, we obviously can have an entire class on World War I, but for the important purposes of Israel, Zionism, and the Palestinians, right, famously, the Ottoman Empire enters in World War I. They enter in on the losing side, and once they lose the war, France and Britain, who are on the winning side of the war, take the Middle East and famously sit there with a map and chop it up and give the blue area to France and the red area to Britain. And so all of a sudden, basically over the course of this war, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. So this empire that existed for 400 years collapses. And all of a sudden, the Middle East, or for the purposes of our conversation, the entirety of Israel is now controlled by the British. And so now, overnight, the Zionist movement stops their, let's say, plan A, which is, well, let's just keep buying up land in the Ottoman Empire until we can either petition or until everybody just recognizes, oh yeah, the Jews are all already there, let's just create a state. And all of a sudden now, to some extent, they're in the same league or the same cultural milieu as the British, because a lot of the early Zionists were British themselves. And so all of a sudden, right, all of the advocacy now turns towards Europe and towards petitioning the English to have a state. I included this funny anecdote because I just like it. I think it's a great joke, where a member of the House of Lords asked Chaim Weizmann, who again was one of the chief advocates for Zionism in England at this time, why are the Jews insisting on Palestine when there are so many other countries that are more convenient? And he says, that's like asking why you drive 20 miles to visit your mother last Sunday when there are many other old ladies living on the street. But again, it speaks to this idea right? One, it's funny, but two, it speaks to this important idea that the return to Israel was not just a political idea, right? Maybe Herzl was just in it for the politics, but the vast majority of all other Zionists, it doesn't matter if they were political Zionists, cultural Zionists, revisionist Zionists, religious Zionists, they were in it for the historic homeland component as well. And I think it also speaks to the fact that to some extent, the international community didn't understand that, and to some extent still has trouble understanding that. Namely, the deep-rooted cultural connection to the land past just a piece of political protection. We can get into that later, but the important thing that happens in 1917 is the Balfour Declaration is issued by British. And so this is when Lord Balfour in the year 1917 issues probably the most vague statement of support for Zionism in history. And there are, again, full books trying to unpack the Balfour Declaration. So I don't want to spend too much time on it because nobody's ever been able to really make sense of it. But here is all of the Balfour Declaration says, right? It's about 7 lines. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in other countries. That is it. And so all of a sudden, this is important because this is the first time that the people in control of the land have said, yes, we are setting into motion, or we are greenlighting this idea to eventually create an autonomous Jewish state. What obviously the Balfour Declaration leaves out is everything else. How are you going to get there? What are the borders going to look like? What are you going to do with the native Arab population? What year is this going to happen? Right? The Balfour Declaration is famously vague, which of course would lead to a lot of controversy moving forward on all parts. And so just so we can see, right, in the year, so right after World War I, right as the British Mandate is forming, the British Mandate didn't officially start until 1922, but already post World War I, it was clear that Britain was in control of not just Israel, but this entire area that you can see on the right, comprising of Jordan and obviously stretching further east. And so all of a sudden in the year 1920, you start to see a series of Arab riots against the Yeshuvim, against Jewish populations living there. Now, I know the numbers are a little bit tough to make out here, but this is a graph where on the bottom you have years, and I don't know why it's so fuzzy here. This is, if you could see my mouse, this is 1872, 1882, this is 1914, 1918, and then this goes to 1931. So the period from 1918 to 1931, you saw a huge uptick in population, both of Jews and of Arabs, right? This is in the post-World War I era, right, after Britain takes over. And this is when the material life on the ground, again, is getting better for everybody, and the population is growing, right? There were about, let's say, 200,000 Jews before World War I. By the 1930s, now there's over 600,000 Jews, right? And you can see the same with Arabs. And of course, right, this will come as no surprise to everybody here, but once more people start moving in, fights over land start to grow, and the Arab population starts to get increasingly upset at what they view as encroaching onto their land and their way of life and their culture. And so a series of riots happen in the 1920s, right? They're what's known as the first Arab riots. And as a result of that, a militia called the Haganah, right? We spoke about this last week. The Haganah just means the defense, right? It's why the IDF is called the Israeli Defense Force. That is formed to mainly protect the Yeshuvim, right? To protect against Arab rioters, right? That was the entire mission of the Haganah, right? This is going to be important a little bit later, right? In 1929, right, one of the worst massacres, right, in the histories of Zionism occurred, which is the Hebron massacre, where dozens of Jews, and again, these were not even, right, not that it makes a moral difference, but it makes, I think, an important historical difference. These were not Zionists that were killed. These were mostly ultra-Orthodox Jews who had been living in the town of Hebron for hundreds of years before that, ultra-Orthodox Jews who probably would have been opposed to the Zionist movement. Again, doesn't make a moral difference, but I think makes a political difference to some extent, right? They are massacred in the city of Hebron, and that is followed by another series of intense riots in the 1920s. And so, sorry, in 1929. And so you see the 20s as this tumultuous period to some extent where Britain's taken over, and so everything is under English law, right? Tons of Jews are coming in, tons of Arabs are coming in, and this, of course, is creating increased tensions between these two groups. And so what do you do if you're Britain now, right? You've been in control of this land for about 10 years, and this is to some extent the first time that Britain realizes that this is not going to be a nice little colonialist enterprise like all of their other times going into the Middle East or Africa and basically being able to pillage the land and using it as for geopolitical strategic reasons, right? Britain is now starting to realize, oh my goodness, right? It seems that we have a problem on hand. What should we do? And so Britain issues what they call the Shaw Commission. And don't worry, I am not going to read all of this, but they issue this committee to basically look at the riots that happened in the 1920s and to figure out what happened, right? Why are the Arabs rioting? Just to read a couple lines from the end, and one of the things we'll see with the Shaw Committee is they come to very similar conclusions that Benny Morris does decades later. So he says, at the end of this, in our opinion, the immediate cause of the outbreaks were the long series of incidents connecting with the Wailing Wall. These must be regarded as a whole, but the incidents among them, which in our view contributed to the outbreak, was the Jewish demonstration at the Wailing Wall. Next in importance, we put the activity for the Society of Protection of Muslim Holy Places and, in a lesser degree, of the Pro-Wailing Wall Committee. So what do you know, right? The same situation that happens, of course, 100 years later. The center of Jerusalem is a flashpoint. Jews want to pray at historic holy sites, right? This upsets local Muslims who also view these sites as holy. And they continue, again, the Shaw Committee continues to describe that the Arab position is looking increasingly bleak, right? Just to read one more line from this middle paragraph, the fundamental cause without which, in our opinion, disturbances either would have not occurred or would have been little more than a riot is the Arab feeling of animosity and hostility towards the Jewish consequent upon the disappointment of their political and national aspirations and fear of their economic future. The feeling as it exists today is based on the twofold fear of the Arabs that by Jewish immigration and land purchases, they may be deprived of their livelihood and in time pass under the political domination of the Jews, right? So again, nothing that will surprise anybody, but already in 1929, right, this is something that people already knew, right? Objective observers that were coming to the land saw the situation, and they were, to some extent, going to be able to predict that this conflict would last for a long time. And again, they continuously note the national aspirations of the Arabs, right? At this point, they weren't really called Palestinians, and also the feeling that they're being squeezed for land. Again, at this point, this is all mostly existing in the cultural and economic realm. This is really before any major Jewish coming in and taking land or going into villages or all of the things that start to happen a little bit later, and we'll see why in a minute. This is before any really physical or military action on the Zionist part, right? This is all, again, economic and cultural influence and an Arab population that's feeling increasingly squeezed. So as a result of this committee, the British government passes the first white paper. This white paper comes and basically is a very anti-Zionist white paper. And what I mean by that is this white paper starts to backtrack from the Balfour Declaration. And this white paper is starting to say, well, maybe we should actually limit Jewish immigration, and maybe we should slow down, and maybe this isn't such a good idea. And right, it very much put the brakes on the Zionist movement. Actually, about 3 months after the white paper was proposed, it was actually rejected by British Parliament. But this was a warning sign and a harbinger for the Zionist movement of what the British government might do. And so this is important, not because this first white paper, again, there'd be a second white paper in 1939 that would be much worse. But in 1930, at this point, this was the first time that some in the Zionist movement stopped seeing Britain as the incredible empire that issued the Balfour Declaration and is predominantly protecting them against the Arabs, to start to say, well, it doesn't seem like the British are really on our side anymore. I don't know why I didn't do that thing where they pop up one by one, but we can see all this information at once. So we get into the late British Mandate period, and in 1930, something extremely important happens, which is the Irgun/Etzel splits off from the Haganah. right? And I mentioned this last week, but all of a sudden now we can understand the political situation of a rising, right? We spoke last week that the revisionist Zionist camp, led by Zev Jabotinsky, who again was alive at this time, right? Unlike Herzl died in, I think, 1903, 1904. Zev Jabotinsky, I forgot when he died, but he was certainly still alive at this point, leading the revisionist Zionist movement. And so he makes the decision, we need our own militia, right? So enough with the Haganah. Let's create our own fighting force to do a couple of things. One, to play offense, for lack of a better word, against the Arabs. And so rather than sit there and say, well, we're going to defend our villages against Arab hostility, which is increasing, right? Rather than say, well, the British will take care of it, right? We trust the British legal system and we trust their army and the police force. This is the first time a Jewish militia says, we don't trust them at all, right? We need to actually go on the offensive. So what does that mean? Well, if a Jewish village is attacked, maybe the next night we go and attack an Arab village. And this is what the Irgun / Etzel is a striking arm of the Irgun, start to do. The second thing they do is begin to exert military pressure on the British. And when I say military pressure on the British, that is a very nice way of saying terrorism to some extent, because they start to do all these things to sabotage the occupying government, which is England. And so the revisionist Zionist camp fully gives up on the idea of the Balfour Declaration. And unlike political Zionists, right, the Haganah, who is saying, no, we should do this through political means, right? Let's just lobby a little more. Let's just advocate. Let's get worldwide Jewish opinion to try to pressure the British government. The revisionist Zionists are, in their own words, taking matters into their own hands and stopping to wait. And so they are starting to increasingly go on the offensive in the 1930s. This, of course, gets even more dire for both sides in 1933 when Hitler comes to power. Again, what I think probably next class, which will be in 2 weeks, we'll obviously discuss what happens in Europe in the 1900s, because that is equally important to Jewish history as what's happening here. But Hitler is not going to be a new name to anybody here, right? Hitler is coming into power, right? He quickly passes increasingly anti-Semitic, right? The Nuremberg laws. This is, of course, pre-concentration camps, but things are bad, and the Zionists knew it. And so you have now increased pressure by the revisionist government side to really increase pressure on everybody to found the state of Israel. But the revisionist Zionist side is ramping up their anti-British antics. One important event, just to see how dire this got, is the assassination of a political Zionist named Chaim Arlozoroff by the revisionist Zionists. Now, a couple of things to say about this. Chaim Arlozoroff, cannot say that 5 times quick. He was a political Zionist, right? So he was on the Zionist team, but he was of the opinion that the Zionist movement should enter into negotiations with Hitler to try to ensure that Jews under Nazi Germany could escape, right? Again, this is pre-Holocaust, pre-concentration camps. This is the Zionist movement realizing this rabid anti-Semite had gotten elected, and what do? Right? So the political Zionist side, or at least some of it, said, let's try to negotiate with Hitler and try to say, hey, listen, you don't like Jews. We're looking for Jews to come move here. Let's try to make a deal. The revisionist Zionist side, right, very much, right, in parallel with a philosophy today saying we don't negotiate with terrorists, said we are unwilling to do anything with the Nazis, right? That is going to legitimize them internationally. And so they were, of course, extremely against any negotiations with Nazi Germany. And this came to a forefront when the chief negotiator in the political Zionist camp, Chaim Arlozoroff, was assassinated. Now, I put a question mark here because they never figured out exactly who did it. But of course, the revisionist Zionist camp was immediately blamed. And the revisionist Zionist side said, well, this is just a modern blood libel. But the political Zionist side is and has been convinced that the revisionist side did it. And most historians think this also was an assassination by the revisionist Zionist side. And so already you see, right, at the basis of even the Zionist movement, it wasn't in the 1930s, everybody on the same team for one end, which is why I think this actually breeds 2 larger important points. One, I think it just allows us to see a lot of the political struggle in Israel through a more historic lens. I mentioned this last time, but just to reiterate it, and I'll probably reiterate it again at the end, the ideological predecessors to the Israeli right and left are the political and revisionist camp. And so Zev Jabotinsky's, let's say, head pupil was a man named Menachem Begin, right? We'll talk about him in a little bit more. Menachem Begin ends up being the founder of the party called Likud, which of course is the party that Yitzhak Shamir and Ariel Sharon and of course Benjamin Netanyahu were prime minister for. And on the other side, the Labor Party, right? That's Ben Gurion, Golda Meir, and Yitzhak Rabin, right? Ehud Barak, right? So just for people who are familiar with more modern history, you can already see that they had, right, very fierce beginnings here. Just a couple more dates, and then I'll take a step back for questions and comments. In the 1930s, right, and again, this is right, everything we know about Nazi Germany, right, just keep that in mind as a parallel to understand increased pressure that's happening in really for everybody in the world at this time. There's a massive revolt in 1936, and this is a much bigger revolt than any of the riots in 1920s. And so you can imagine, right, the chaos that is spinning out of control, right? You have all of these different groups with very different desires, right? You have the British Empire who's controlling over British Mandate Palestine, and all they want is to basically be in charge of this very important geopolitical piece of land, right? All of a sudden, they have all of these groups that hate them, right? They have the Arabs who are starting to view the British increasingly as a threat against them. And so the Arabs are putting pressure, and they're starting to get other international countries to back their pressure against the British. You have the political Zionists who are putting all of this lobbying and economic pressure on the British government to make good on their promise to create a country, right, in the Balfour Declaration. And now you have the revisionist Zionists who are increasingly ramping up their attacks, both against the Arabs and against the British. And so the British, of course, do what they did last time, which is they call in a committee and they say, what is happening, right? How should we solve this? And so they issue what is called the Peel Commission Plan in 1937. And this is also important because this is really the first time that a two-state solution is proposed. And so the history of the two-state solution discussion, I guess, goes back to 1937. And so they look at the land, and this is what they propose, right? The blue would be a Jewish state, the red would be an Arab state, and the white or yellow in the middle would be an internationally controlled area. The reason why this shape looks so funky is because they wanted to make sure to include both Jerusalem and Jaffa, which was the port, right, in the international area. And so they said neither Israel, right, they said the port would remain international and Jerusalem, the holy city, would remain international, but we would create this country. This was rejected across the board by the Arabs. The Arabs, right, there were obviously, right, not all the Arabs thought the same thing, but some of the more radical elements were led by al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was a rabid anti-Semite, right? He met with Hitler throughout the 1930s, right? Obviously, not all Arabs that were living there were that extreme, but the vast majority, if not any Arab who had a voice that was influential in the community, outright rejected it. When this came to the Zionists, obviously, all of the revisionist Zionists said, no way. And the political Zionist camp was torn, with a plurality rejecting it, but a lot of others trying to accept this, because throughout the 1930s, it was becoming increasingly clear that the future of Jewish life in Europe was becoming bleak. And so they were willing to, again, just like their ideology stipulates, political autonomy, right, is what we're after, right? Who cares or not who cares, but questions about the grandeur of land and historicity and having, you know, places that we read about in the Torah are a lot less important. And so this is mostly accepted by the political Zionists, but ultimately both sides would not be very happy about this arrangement. And so this never took off. But as a result of this getting rejected, the British now issue another white paper in 1939, which for those historians out there know, this is right when World War II starts. So now things are becoming increasingly tricky for the Jewish population here. First of all, just to understand these white papers would allow only 15,000 Jews a year over 5 years. Now, 1939 is the time when Jews needed immigration the most in probably all of Jewish history, because the Holocaust was obviously starting at this point. And so this is when the pressure of immigration was at historic levels. And all of a sudden, the British government is passing this white paper that's a huge slap in the face to basically the entire Zionist movement. We get Ben-Gurion's famous line that he issued after it, which is, "We will fight the war," meaning World War II, "as if there is no white paper, and the white paper as if there is no war." And that's a great quote to try to explain just the tensions that were happening in the Zionist or the political Zionist movement at this time, because right when World War II happened, and especially as knowledge of what was happening to the Jews in Europe was becoming increasingly widespread, both the Haganah and Etzel basically made a pact and decided they were going to call off any attempts to fight with British soldiers. And so they basically said, we want the British to be at their full fighting force to fight the Nazis, right? We are no longer going to, skirmish or make riots or all of these things. There actually was one very radical element of the revisionist Zionist camp known as the Stern Gang or Lehi, just for people that have heard that. They actually went so far, this was a tiny radical group, so this does not even represent revisionist Zionists, but they actually, in at least the late 1930s, they were on the Nazi side against the British because they were trying to get the British to lose, right? They obviously flipped, right, once it became increasingly clear of how dumb of a move that was. But 95+% of the Zionist world basically decided whatever qualms we have with the British here, right, we need to back off. And this will be the last slide until I take some comments. So they switched all of their military action from, rather than fight the British, let's just spend all of our time and effort and money and resources and weaponry into illegal immigration. And so this is called by historians Aliyah Bet, right? The first Aliyah was in the late 1800s. This is called Aliyah Bet, which connotes some sort of secrecy here. And from 1938 to 1944, 100,000 Jews were snuck into Palestine. And from 1944 to 1948, again, post-World War II, in the Bricha movement, hundreds of thousands of more reached Palestine. And probably the most famous thing to come out of this in terms of, right, because Leon Uris popularized the book in the 1950s, was The Exodus Ship, which, if you haven't read the book, The Exodus by Leon Uris, it is a great novel. And this is, I believe, from The Exodus Ship, and I'll explain what that story is in a minute, but this says, the Germans destroyed our families and homes, don't you destroy our hopes. And so again, a very powerful message, because this was, again, both during the Holocaust and right after the Holocaust, there were millions of Jewish refugees. I mean, one of the lines that David Hartman or Daniel Hartman always says that strikes an emotional chord was that in the 1940s, the most common adjective to come after the word Jew was refugee. And once the state of Israel was founded, there have not been any real Jewish refugees in history. And so just to imagine the situation, both during the Holocaust and after, there were millions of Jews whose homes were destroyed, who were trying to flee, and no country wanted them. I mean, one of the black boxes of American history also is how many votes America turned away. And this is still at a time when Britain was under these white papers. And so illegal immigration switched, but then there was also, and the Exodus, I think, is a great example here, is the last thing I'll say before any questions or comments, is trying to now beseech world opinion. And so now this ceases to be just a Jewish versus British and trying to put political and economic pressure on the British. All of a sudden, especially as knowledge of the Holocaust is spreading throughout the world, Israel doesn't exist yet. The Zionists are looking towards the rest of the world and saying, hey, you need to help us. And so they would do, again, things that some might call publicity stunts, again, for very good reason, right? Such as, right, the story of the Exodus ship. Obviously, there were 6,000 people on it, right? This is a boat that illegally tried to sneak into Palestine. It was held up. It was sent to Cyprus. And they basically spent, like, I forgot how many months, but months docked right outside of Palestine. And the entire world knew about this. And it was shaping world opinion. And so trying to, again, convince the world that the Zionist cause was not only just and important, but it was immediately important. Okay, any thoughts or questions on sort of the second stage of Zionism? So we started 1881 to 1914. Now we just did 1914 to 1947 in the British Mandate. Okay, so we can move on a little bit. So this, of course, this slide will probably be more familiar to a lot of you, but this leads Britain to give this to the newly formed United Nations to try to figure out what to do. Again, they are, right, after World War II, just to backtrack a little bit, after World War II, so of course, there's about 4 years between World War II and the UN vote, maybe 3.5 years, pressure on the British is increasing from all circles. International political pressure on the British, and now even the political Zionist camp, even the Haganah, is so upset with the British once they're finding out what actually happened in Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, that even they are basically engaging the British in occasional battles, right? Not to mention what the revisionist Zionists are doing, right? Most notably, they blew up the King David Hotel and killed 100+ British officers, families, right? Civilians, right? So just chaos is everywhere now. And so Britain, of course, wants to get out as soon as possible. And so they give it to the newly formed UN, who does the same thing that the Peel Commission did 10 years previously, right? They go, they survey the land, they talk to people, they collect data, and then this is what they issue for their two-state solution. Of course, the blue would be a Jewish state, the yellow would be an Arab state. And now just a couple things to note about this, this map. One, the amount of political lobbying that had to be done to get a 2/3 vote in the world was incredible. I mean, there's such interesting stories of diplomats trying to petition, you know, different countries' leaders to try to vote yes in terms of a Jewish state. And they did not think this was going to happen, meaning this was not what, let's say, the political pollsters at the time would have predicted. In terms of the actual land itself, one of the things that you'll probably notice is that here the Jewish state would be a good amount bigger than in the Peel Commission. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, most of that land is the Negev, which is not negligible, but it's very much inhospitable. Even today, only a tiny % of Israelis or Arabs or anybody lives south of about where my mouse is, right? There's a couple big cities there, but it's really just desert and sand dunes. But this, again, speaks to the fact that the geography was constantly shifting. And here is where we get into more shaky historical claims, where from the 1930s, especially as the revisionist Zionist camp is starting to gain a lot of military power, now is when you start to get some of the claims, and I saw some written in the comments before, that there were forcibly taking of lands, or at least military or physical pressure enough that lands switch hands in, shall we say, morally opaque ways. We can get into that a little bit more in a second once we introduce the war. But this immediately is accepted by the entirety of the political Zionist world. And so Ben-Gurion and all of the other political Zionists said, this is great, we will take this deal. There are millions of Jewish refugees that need a home right now. We accept it. The revisionist Zionist camp that was at this point led by Menachem Begin said, of course not. This is a terrible deal. We want the entire land. And again, at that point, when they said the entire land, they don't even mean all of this. They mean also Jordan and some of Iraq and some of Saudi Arabia, right? That's the map we saw last week. But ultimately, the political Zionists had the power. The entire Arab world, again, says no to this. And so the day after the UN partition vote, in November 30th, 1947, is what started the independence war. And the independence war in Israel actually had two parts, right? A lot of times we think of it as just one war, but part one was a civil war, which was a series of internal riots that were greater even than the 1930s riots. And so now you have all of these, right? And just one more comment about this partition, because this will help understand the war a little bit. You can see that in a lot of places, people are right on top of each other. Again, the area of this blue is maybe like 10 miles, right? So this is not, you know, people being very separate. This is two groups that are becoming increasingly distrustful of each other, living right on top of each other and right next to each other. And so the map is like this because that's where the people were naturally already living. And so it's not as if the UN arbitrarily drew a line that made no sense and said, here, this will be great, right? They were responding to where, of course, people were already living, which was basically sporadic and random, and it depended on where they were able to buy land and what, and some natural resources. Again, that is a tangent for another time. Just one other comment about the map is that Jerusalem here is still white, and that was supposed to be still under UN control. And so the UN did not grant control of Jerusalem to either the Jews or the Arabs. Obviously, it was in the middle of the Arab land body, which is something that the Zionist movement did not like, but they were, again, willing to acquiesce on this deal because of the amount of refugees. And so in 1947, this starts a multi-month civil war, which has, again, all of these local Arab groups and militias and all of these things taking up arms and trying to take back the country, basically. And of course, we know how this war ends, right? The Zionist movement, which at that point had not just one militia, but several, right? They had the Haganah, they had the Irgun, they had Lehi, right? At a certain point, all of these militias banded together to become the IDF. So it's not that the Etzel or the Irgun dissolved, they just became under control of the IDF. And one comment to make about that, and just to speak about, right, one of the people in Israel's history and Zionist history who ends up becoming a hero, and he becomes a hero even though if you were a pollster in the year 1930, you might not have thought you would become a hero, and he's become a hero even to a lot of the Israeli left, is Menachem Begin. Because Menachem Begin, even though he was part of the revisionist movement and had extremely hardline views, right, he ends up getting elected to government in the 1970s and makes peace with Egypt. But even before that, he, perhaps more than anybody else in the Zionist movement, was responsible for the fact that there was not a civil war in the 1940s between the revisionist camp and the political camp, right? These two groups hated each other. This wasn't just, oh, you voted Democrat, right? I'd rather not have dinner with you, right? These were two groups that really were always on the verge of war. There were times that they actually fired on each other, right? One notable incident is called the Altalina, right? We won't get into that too much, but if you're curious, feel free to Google it. But Menachem Begin, the second war starts, he tells his entire militia force of, again, these very radical band of militia who are unhappy with partition plan and who hate political Zionists, hey, you actually need to start fighting under the banner of Ben Gurion and political Zionists. Do whatever they say. After the war, we'll figure it out politically, but we are not going to fight against them, which was, again, a huge, important step in Israel's history to push forward. But this civil war happens, right? The Zionist side is able to win, right? And in winning, they not only win, but they end up, of course, conquering more land, because one of the things that happened was there were all these Arab villages that took up arms. And so once that happened, right, you can imagine if war breaks out, right, you don't just defend your front porch and then go back home, right? You're trying to push the enemy back, and that's happening back and forth. This, of course, proliferates even more, right? Months later, when Ben Gurion officially in May of, right, this is November to May is what, 5-6 months? So half a year later, in the middle of this independence civil war, Ben Gurion officially establishes the state. And that day, basically that afternoon, all of the surrounding countries declare war on Israel. We don't have time to get too much into the war, but again, this is Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, militias from Iraq. In terms of numbers, by the way, Israel was so outnumbered. I mean, it's almost a joke. I think Israel's army was 10% of the total army of the enemy. And again, there's a lot of different historic deep dives as to why this happened. Probably one of the answers that comes to the surface, there's a couple of them. One, Israel had and continues to has one of the best intelligence systems in the world. And so, right, this is when a lot of early Israeli intelligence, right, think the Mossad, think other groups, were just so strategically better and so much better at collecting intelligence. It gave them a crazy advantage. One fascinating book, I wasn't going to mention this, but it's a really awesome book. It's by the journalist Mati Friedman, and the book is called Spies of No Country. And it's this book about, in the late 1940s, even before Israel becomes a country, the IDF and the nascent Mossad recruited all of these Mizrahi Jews who were still living in these Arab countries. Because again, at this point, there were still tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Syrian Jews and Egyptian Jews and Iraqi Jews. and they were still living there, right? They would soon not be living there as a result of Israel's being founded, but they were still living there. And the Mossad basically recruited them to spy for Israel. And so it's this book called Spies of No Country, because it's fascinating, because there was no country that they were spying for, but they were official spies of the Zionist movement, which of course comes with its own moral complications. And I'll just say two things on that. One of the reasons why it's morally complicated was because these Arab countries would soon start suspecting all local Jews as Zionists, which was historically completely incorrect, right? We don't have, of course, Pew polling from, let's say, Egypt in 1950, but if you ask your average Egyptian Jew in 1950, are you a Zionist? Do you want to move to Israel? Their answer would probably be, no, like, I'm happy here. I don't need to move to Israel. But at a certain point, these local Arab governments started viewing any Jew that was living in the entirety of the country as, well, I don't know, you might be a Zionist spy. So that's one reason why it's complicated. Two, when a lot of these Mizrahi Jews end up coming into Israel as a result of the independence war, Israel did not always treat them very well. But after this war, the results are there are about 600,000 Palestinians, and I call this the Palestinian exodus from Israel. Exodus is a very morally bland word. I'm also going to say the Jewish exodus from Arab countries. So, you know, I'm not playing favorites here, but as a result of this war, 600,000 Arabs that previously lived in the land of Israel were now either in the West Bank, Jordan, or in some refugee camp. And at the same time, roughly the same number, some estimates put it at a little higher, 700 or 800,000 Arab Jews are now overnight kicked out of their own country that they've lived in, again, for 2, if not 3,000 years. And so the independence war, of course, had huge consequences for basically all sides. I actually realized this is the wrong map. This is the partition map again. So let me decrease this while I pause for any questions and show an actual map of Israel after 1948. Oops, did not mean to go on Google Maps. If anybody has any questions while I am trying to find a picture here, go for it. And here we get a picture after the 1949 armistice. Right here gets a lot closer to what we think of today when we say Israel, although after 1967 it changes a little bit. But we have this, I don't even know what to call this. The orange is Israel. The green, of course, is now under Jordanian control. So one of the major things that happened after independence war is, of course, because the Palestinians said no to partition, there was never a Palestinian state created, and of course hasn't been since. And so the land in which would have made the bulk of the Palestinian state became under Jordan rule. And that's true with both the West Bank, and then also here is the Gaza Strip, which became under Egyptian rule. And there were some demilitarized zones right up north by the Golan Heights, and then also right by Egypt. And those were areas in which were particularly hot border areas. And so those areas were patrolled by UN peacekeeping forces, which historically effectively did nothing aside from standing there. And every time anybody declared war on anybody else, they very quickly fled back to Europe. That's a little bit of a cynical take, but that seemingly is what happened. So again, back to here, we have 1948 war, and now finally, right, the Zionist movement had been in full force for about 70 or 80 years, and all of a sudden, Israel is declared a state. Israel has its borders, and now all of the problems that happened were no longer problems inside the Zionist movement. They would become internal Israeli political problems, which of course they had many. I see there are a couple comments in the chat, so just to give me a minute to look. Yeah, Michael says that the Israelis had a major advantage because they metaphorically had the sea on their back, meaning on this side, there was truly this idea, which is probably pretty historically accurate, that the Jews at this point are fighting for not just their personal lives, but for their collective lives. Again, this is years after the Holocaust, and most of the people fighting in the independence war or the 1948 war were Holocaust survivors, or they had been Zionists the whole time. And so there really are stories I mean, some of the accounts of this is incredible. Holocaust survivors coming in 1945 or 46, and a year later, they're basically on the front lines fighting against, these irregular armies from Iraq that are coming in to destroy them. Michael, go for it.
I just want to say that actually this was the slogan of the Arab states, to throw the Jews to the sea. And I've heard even Egyptian broadcast in my younger years in Israel in Hebrew by Egyptian who apparently spoke Hebrew, that they'll be coming and throw us to the sea. So this was worked out as an advantage because they knew this is the last stand that we can have, like a Masada, after the Holocaust especially. So that was our strength.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there was a lot of, one of the complications, just to get back to this, the Palestinian exodus from Israel, there's a lot written about this. I saw Ruth probably like half an hour ago put in the chat that the city of Lod, which used to be called Lydia, which is where Ben Gurion Airport is, used to be a Palestinian town that was basically entirely taken over by force during the 1948 war. There was basically three things that all happened at once. And here's why the 1948 war is so controversial. And you can get, if you ask a right-wing pro-Israel or a centrist or a pro-Palestinian author, you will get three just completely different stories of what happened, is because three things happened at the same time, and we don't really know in what extent, right? One was, of course, when all of these armies started coming in, Egypt and Syria and all these countries basically told the local populations, get out of our way, we're gonna come in, we're gonna, as Michael said, push the Jews into the sea, and then you'll come back home. And so you had hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of Arabs leaving their villages. And when the dust settled and the war ended, Israel obviously wanted to draw their borders in a place that was more secure than this map that you see here. And so at a certain point, once the war ended, they just said, okay, well, we are now not going to have this sort of checker situation. We need this area, right? So that's one thing that happened. The second thing that happened is that these local Arab villages even took up arms against Israel. And so they were combatants in a war, right? The third thing that happened was, and this is where it gets controversial, right? There were obviously also accounts of the Haganah or the IDF or wings of the IDF that were, again, more revisionist minded, even though they were part of the IDF, accounts of them actually going into villages like Deir Yassin and like Lydia and all of these accounts that you hear, and actually forcibly pushing out the people there. To what extent all of these different things were in play, again, people will probably forever be debating about that. But that's why it's so complicated. And that's why you could have one narrative about 1948 that said, this is a Nakba, it was a catastrophe, this was a united Zionist effort to kick all of the Palestinians out of land, right? They'll cherry pick some nice quotes from Ben Gurion during the war saying, well, we need to conquer this area and this area for strategic importances. And then if you want to have a, very traditional pro-Israel view, you can basically say the opposite. Those one or two incidents that are recorded are isolated incidents. And really what happened was they joined the enemies in the war. And how can you blame Israel for saying yes to partition? The Arabs said no, and then the Arabs attacked, right? You can't blame Israel when they end up conquering a little bit of land. And so you can see this dual narrative coming on, and people here can decide whichever they think is more likely. But this, again, obviously resulted in Israel being created. And not only was Israel created, obviously, but Israel was created from compromise. And what do I mean by that, right? Obviously, there was a geographic compromise, because when any Jew throughout history pictured the land of Israel, I can promise you they were not picturing what Israel looked like in 1949, but there was a willingness to compromise in terms of the land. There was a religious compromise of Ben Gurion, which seemingly has come back to haunt the state of Israel for the past 75 years, this was before 1948. This is when Ben Gurion was pushing the international community to accept partition. And he realized that there were tons of ultra-Orthodox Jews living in Israel. It would not be good for public opinion if the people who look, I'm using quotes here for people that are only listening and can't see my hands, the people who are the most Jewish looking, at least, or culturally, if they all said, no, actually, we're not Zionists, we're against this happening. And that was a very real prospect of happening. And so Ben-Gurion met with ultra-Orthodox leaders and said, listen, you don't like Zionism. I don't particularly like, ultra-Orthodoxy Judaism. What if you guys at least say you're on board with the Zionist project and with Israel? In return, I will give you religious control over certain important functions, such as marriage, such as family law, and increasingly in Israel, it seems like other avenues of the public sphere. And so, right, still today, the Rabbanut, right, one of the areas which is endlessly confusing for Americans to understand about Israel, which has no separation of church and state, is this compromise where ultra-Orthodox Jews are in control, say, of marriage, even though in polling data, 85% of people living in Israel want there to be something like secular marriage. This was also an economic compromise because Ben-Gurion, again, was a full socialist, but very soon after Israel being founded, it started introducing slowly at first, but then very quickly, more capitalistic and free market tendencies, right? Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Israel's biggest supporter, by the way, was Russia and the Soviet Union. And then in the 50s and 60s, it slowly switches to liberal democracies. And so France was actually Israel's biggest ally in the first 15 years, right? It gave Israel weaponry and probably nuclear weapons, even though Israel's never admitted to that, right? And then obviously America ends up being Israel's biggest backer. But initially, it was actually more communistic countries. But once they realized Israel was not going to be a full-blown communist country, right, Israel started being backed by the West, and the Soviet Union started backing Arab powers, which we'll probably have to wait till next time or a future time to talk about the other wars. And then one other just fascinating debate, and we'll end off here, and then we'll need probably another half a session for the rest of Israel, which I'll figure out how that fits into our last three classes. One of the big debates in early Israel, and one of the big compromises that Israel made, was about reparations from Germany. So in 1952, again, as knowledge about the Holocaust was spreading throughout the world, Germany offered to pay a very high sum of reparation money to Israel, right, basically because of the Holocaust. Now you can imagine the arguments for both sides. On the one hand, it seems like if Israel takes this reparations from Germany, that's basically like accepting their apology and letting them off the hook. And so there were several hardliners in Israel that were extremely against this. The chief opponent of this, will probably be no surprise to you, was Menachem Begin. And actually one of the ways in which Menachem Begin became popular, and one of the ways in which he started gaining support, again, he was in the minority, right? So once the government was founded, it was a labor government, a socialistic government, but Menachem Begin, again, stopped being the head of this Etzel militia band and started being just a normal politician in the opposition, right? He led the campaign against reparations from Germany. On the other hand, Israel ultimately took reparations because what they said was, one, they need the money. Israel's population actually doubled in its first 4 years, which is unheard of for countries. And there were all of these refugees pouring in, both from Europe and then also from the Middle East. And so Israel ultimately accepted the reparations from Germany, but this was another flashpoint of early Israel between, again, the compromisers versus the hardliners. And to some extent, Israel has been, right, still to the past 75 years, right, has had these strong political debate element, not just Israeli-Palestinian, but also internal to the Zionistic camp, which, I mean, just because, I'm going to skip about 70 years, but just because it's been all over the news, I feel like I almost have to mention what's been happening in the last 2 days, right? So anybody who's checked the news, right, has seen that Israel has basically seen the largest protest in Israel's history that happened basically today. There was a huge strike across Israel. People are quitting that are in high positions of government. One of the reasons why this is happening is because of a power struggle, a political power struggle between Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli right and the Supreme Court, which they view to be too liberal. And so this is to some extent the exact same debate as between the revisionists and the political Zionists, where you have two different visions for what you want a country. I mean, it's a little more complicated than I'm making it out to be. I'm happy to stay endlessly and chat about this, but you have two different visions for what Zionism and what Israel should be. One vision is more hardline and let's say, a little bit less caring about the democratic elements, whereas the other is more liberal and democratic and a little bit less caring about some of the Jewish elements. Again, oversimplification, but I think it holds true. And one of the ways in which this debate has really come to the forefront in the past 25 years is through the Supreme Court. Because in 1948, this does connect to 1948, I just made this connection in my head, Ben-Gurion was a little bit too busy to draft a constitution because they were in the middle of a war. And so you can imagine if you're setting up a country, you want to have, weeks at a time to sit down at a nice round table over nice breakfast at a conference and draft a draft a constitution with a cross section of your entire population. Israel was founded quite literally in the middle of a war. And so there was, of course, no time to draft a constitution. There was a Declaration of Independence, which in a lot of ways functions as a basis of rights in Israel. But throughout Israel's history, again, there's been no constitution. But because Israel is a democracy, there's a Supreme Court that acts as a check on the Knesset and the prime minister, which is the legislator. Israel also has the British system, so they don't have the executive and legislative. They are collapsed into one. And so the Supreme Court is the only check on the legislative's power. And so about 25 years ago, not coincidentally, as Israel's politics were moving more towards the right, the Supreme Court basically said, I think Amnon Bozak, who was the head of the Supreme Court, said, we are instituting a constitutional revolution, where he basically said, the Supreme Court is going to have A, B, and C ability and power to check the legislative. And people on the right who saw the Supreme Court as mostly limiting their power, because as Israel went more to the right, they, let's say, cared a little bit less about minority rights, Arab rights, LGBTQ rights, things like that. And the Supreme Court constantly said, nope, sorry, you can't do that. It's unconstitutional. Whereas the right said, what the heck are you talking about? There's no constitution. And so the Supreme Court has been at the center of political turmoil for about a generation. But now, about 3 or 4 months ago, we were introduced to the most right-wing government in Israel's history. It was made up of ultra-Orthodox, religious Zionists, and again, hardcore revisionists, such as Bibi. And one of the first things they did is propose this grand overhaul of the judicial system, which critics say will just completely neuter any power that the Supreme Court has. And so the reason why you are now watching videos on the front page of the New York Times and CNN of quite literally millions of people taking to the streets and striking is because the wider Israeli public is afraid that the current government is trying to knock down the only other check on power on the legislator, which will, in the eyes of some of the more bleak forecasters, will make Israel not even a liberal democracy. So that's what's happening now. But again, you can see the underpinnings of a lot of these debates already from the outset, where, I mean, we're all familiar with the joke that you have 2 Jews and you get 3 opinions. And the founding of Israel and Zionism was, of course, not a story of millions of people who all agreed on everything. This was a story of millions of people who agreed on one basic thing and disagreed about all of the other components of there. Ruth, go for it. And then I'll also read through some of the chat.
Well, I think it's interesting that the Sabras, or when the Holocaust survivors came, they weren't looked upon very favorably. They were called the Vusvus because they kept saying Vus. And it wasn't until the Eichmann trial, really, when we had people who openly testified in court, that I think that many of the Israelis really finally got it. The people who had not been there, and they really finally got it. I mean, we have problems with Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews. And I think it's interesting that the Declaration of Independence, when I was there, I mean, I was so struck by the fact that it talks about tolerance, and but doesn't show very much.
Yeah, a couple things. One, I mean, for anybody here, I strongly recommend reading through the Declaration of Independence. It's very short. It's like 5-6 paragraphs. And it's beautiful because it quotes from prophets from 2,500 years ago and modern ideas, and really does talk about protections for everybody. You also said something about the Holocaust, which I think was interesting and important, because another big tension in early Israel was actually to try to specifically not talk about the Holocaust. And so for the first 15 or 20 years, Israel purposely tried to, I don't want to say sweep it under the rug because that sounds too pedantic, but almost the philosophy was almost, this is what happens when weak Jews have no power. We are strong Jews that have power, therefore, let's just not even mention it. And that went, right, there was no national celebration of it. People never talked about it. It wasn't in pop culture. And you're right, in the 1950s, right, that obviously underwent a shift there. And then today, obviously, it's central to Israel's memory and politics and things like that. But it really was a big switch where a lot of early Zionists, right, again, because early Zionism, I mean, we can, again, spend, an entire year talking about all of the different branches of Zionism and interesting parts. One of the goals of at least secular Zionism was to completely reinvent the image of what a Jew was. I mean, for hundreds of years, the image of a Jew, especially in Europe, was sort of this weak, feeble, man who's sitting there, with hunchback studying Talmud. And the entire purpose and ethos of Zionism was to say, we are reinventing that. We are, men of the field now. We are men of war. We are hearkening back to this time in history, right? Say the Maccabees or other parts where we were, strong and powerful, and sort of throwing out, right? There was a throwing out of the diaspora that early Zionism tried to do, which it totally makes sense why they tried to do it. But just in terms of a framework of understanding Jewish history and philosophy, the last 2,000 years of Jewish history were very important, right? We did a lot of, things weren't always great, but we did a lot of great things, right? As a Jewish community, we produced a lot of great works. The community thrived at times. There was ideas and literature and culture that was produced. And there's this sort of meta question of how valuable was that? And so if you ask me, that was extremely valuable. If you ask a certain type of Zionist in the 1920s or 30s, that was all a historical mistake that the return to Israel has corrected. And because that was a historical mistake from that perspective, that means that any of the production of exile and diaspora should also be thrown out. And you can even see that in modern Israel today, right? In the education system in Israel, all students have to learn Tanakh, right? So the same way an American student learns Shakespeare, right? If you're in 6th grade in Israel, you're learning stories about Tanakh. There's no national course about the Talmud or Midrash or medieval literature or anything like that. And so on the one hand, you can say, okay, well, the Tanakh kind of makes sense, right? It's located in Israel, but this is also still sort of left over from anything produced in exile is a dark part of our history. Let's not focus too much on it. Let's only focus on the sort of, more macho-y Tanakh stories, which personally, I think that's a mistake, but I understand why they felt the need to reinvent it. Ruth, do you have something else? Yeah,
I did want to say, I think it's very interesting. I mean, most of the early settlers were not really, many of them came from religious backgrounds, but became communists, socialists, which kind of eschewed religion. But when they were not necessarily religious young men and women, and yet Ben-Gurion gave away the store to the Orthodox just to get their votes. And I see that again with Netanyahu. He's given away the store just to get the rights votes. It's very frightening. I mean, appointing the Orthodox as the religious authority over everything in Israel is really making life very difficult for Reform Jews. I had a friend who was a rabbi, a conservative rabbi, and he had a hard time. And he, lived there for many, many years. So it's, be careful what you sow, what you reap might not be too good.
Yeah, I'll just say there was a historic irony, I think is probably the best way to put it. Both Ben-Gurion and also the Forward, which used to be, again, a socialist Yiddish newspaper, now it's just, op-eds about the Jewish community. But they had an op-ed in the 1940s, I want to say, but give or take a decade or two. But it was, I think, right after the Holocaust, that basically said, meet the last generation of Orthodox Jews. And it was all about how they are predicting demographically that Orthodox Judaism would, will have completely died out by the 1970s or 80s. And Ben-Gurion made the same prediction, right? Like we have notes of this, that he thought that, well, give these, couple thousand rabbis, these political power, within 2 generations, right? Everybody's going to be, secular and whatever. Obviously they were wrong in both cases, but it very much was, the sentiment at the time, right? So he did not, I think Ben-Gurion would be the most surprised if he were to show back up in modern day Israel and realize they were having public debates over whether or not hospitals are allowed to serve chametz on Passover to patients that, don't care about Passover, right? Like he would be the first one to be shocked.
Daniel, I just want to say thank you for this great class. Yet another home run in terms of how you so clearly captured such a complex situation, or piece of our history. I wanted to just be clear that this class are you not teaching next Monday?
No, so we're going to take, I actually have the schedule until this class ends. So
right, so the next 2 classes will be April 10th and 17th.
Yeah, and that is it.
Now, Daniel, what we can do is we're supposed to start the intro class on the 24th. If you want to extend this 1 more week and do the last 3 weeks in April, and if there's more, then we can. I think the intro class has about 5 people signed up for it so far. We can just let them know that it's coming. So if you want to extend this, you can let me know, and we'll let the group know.
Yeah, we'll talk. I'll figure out.
Okay. Anyway,
I don't think this class should ever end.
I don't think so either. I think it's the greatest class of all time. And Daniel, the next thing I want to talk to you about is, I think it'd be great if we could actually do a mini-mester on different Zionisms. I mean, in a really deep way. That would be so interesting. And that hasn't been taught in like the public sphere. I had to take that like in rabbinical school, but it would be wonderful to teach it to this group.
Excuse me, what were the dates of the last 2 classes?
So
April
the 10th and 17th of April.
Okay.
With a possible class on April 24th, if Daniel's still talking, which he may be.
I might be on a plane, but I will be still talking. It just might be
on the 20. Oh, yeah, that's right. On the 24th, you can anyway. All right, or maybe we'll have a reunion or something. But thank you all, and I know you've all enjoyed this so much, and you can go back and watch any of the recordings on the website. If you just go to Advanced Learning Institute and click on Pathways into Judaism, and you'll see all of Daniel's classes with the titles and the source sheets and the recording, and you can go to town.
Is there a way to get the source sheets? Like when you put up these little graphics on, it would be great to be able to print out our own little booklet of a summary of the outline of your history. Because after these 20 weeks, that's a history that just lets us use your words to remind ourselves of what you're teaching. So
now, Daniel, you gave Madalena your whole
I can
PDF.
put them all on one doc if that's like at the end, and it'll just probably be a 200-page Google Doc if that's interesting to people.
But or if your PowerPoints, if you can subdivide them by the class that you